everybody, welcome to the topic of what it's like to be an occupational therapist with a disability. Casey had reached out to me a few weeks ago asking if I would share my story and my experiences as a student and as well as an occupational therapist who is practicing with a disability. So to introduce myself, I'm Jordan and I have sensorineural hearing loss. At that time when I was a student, but now I am considered profoundly deaf, and I will get more into that later. So to start off, I graduated from EKU in 2010 and in 2012, both with my bachelor's and my master's degree in occupational science and occupational therapy. The reason why I picked EKU was for two reasons. They had a very strong deaf and hard of hearing services, and also I was very interested in doing occupational therapy. A lot of colleges are not familiar with the needs for deaf and hard of hearing students, and so that was one of the things that I loved about EKU. Not only did they understand their accommodation, they actually had a place to go to request the services that I needed, to figure out what would work best for me in the classroom setting. And so that is why I ended up coming here. So as a student, at that time, I had mild to moderate to severe hearing loss in my left ear, and then in my right ear, I had moderate to severe to almost profound hearing loss in my right ear. If you have any references to what kind of hearing loss there is, there are different degrees. There's mild, there's moderate to severe, there's severe, and then there's profound. And I also wore hearing aids at that time as a student. My accommodations in the beginning were pretty simple and straightforward. I always requested to make sure I could sit in the front, which was never a problem because no one really likes to sit in front of a class anyways. And that gave me direct access to the professor's face, and I relied really heavily on lip reading, so that also helped me give me clarity on what was being said and making sure I was obtaining the information. I also used a note taker, and a note taker is one of your peers in your classroom. They get paid for this, and they will have like a carbon copy paper, and they'll take notes throughout the entire class, and then at the end of the session they just tear it off and they give me a copy, and then they keep their own. And that was pretty much it for me, because most of the time the classroom settings were very more of the traditional, the professor was speaking and as students were taking notes. So that kind of changed as far as the dynamics of how the classroom was setting up as you got further along in the program. It was leaning more towards group discussions and really just facilitating the class as a whole to jump in and really get involved in the topic of the day or whatever we were talking about. Well, I realized at that time two things. My hearing had changed, so I had a drop in my hearing, and then on top of it, I was really struggling to scan the room because I lip read. I do hear, but I also lip read to make that communication click and understand what you're saying. But I couldn't keep up. I was trying to figure out who said what, and by the time I knew who was speaking, someone else had jumped into the conversation. And I just kind of had a moment like, oh my goodness, I'm about to jump into a profession where part of our job is to advocate for our clients, and this was a good lesson for me because I had to really step it up and advocate for myself in order to be the OT that I want to be in the future. And so I ended up going back to the deaf and hard of hearing services and requesting interpreters. And that was such a huge change for me, and it definitely bridged the gap for the communication between the professors and then the group discussion, and then for me as a student, I was able to get the full picture of what was going on. So my interpreter, they followed me out through the rest of graduate school, and they also came with me during my internships. So my first internship, I was at a school system, and then my second one, I ended up doing a skilled nursing facility / acute rehab, plus a little bit of home health. And I ended up getting my first job from my second rotation because they learned how to work with me, and there happened to be a job opening, and I jumped right on it. And they were the best, most accommodating, and it was such an easy transition for as a student who learned to build my confidence in this setting, on top of being in a setting with a director who was willing to work with me and make the accommodations that I needed. And at that time, we realized there were 4 things that were really important, and I learned a lot from being a student in this kind of facility and this kind of setting, because it's more fast-paced. It's not one-on-one. There's lots of people going in and out. You're talking to multiple people, not just OTs. You're talking to speech and nurses, and you're talking to the doctors, the physician, to figure out the protocols, restrictions. You're talking to the kitchen, and you're also talking to your director, your boss. There are a lot of components, and there's a lot of people to communicate with. So we realized 4 things, like I said. The first thing is we had a rehab tech. So she was really awesome, and she would go around and do errands, communicate so-and-so is ready for therapy. They're ready to be picked up for therapy. She would send in random messages on the walkie-talkie, so she wasn't having to come back and forth and waste a lot of time. But I couldn't hear on the walkie-talkie because it's staticky, and I didn't have access to her face, and so I couldn't read her lips. So for me, she would come back to the therapy room, and then she would just write it down on my little schedule paper and just tell me, hey, so-and-so is ready. When you're done with X, Y, and Z, you can go ahead and get them if you want. The second thing we noticed is that yes, people knew how to get my attention in this big therapy room, but the problem was that even though you had my attention, you were so far away, I couldn't read your lips, so I was having a hard time with that communication. So my coworkers just made it really simple. They would walk over and tell me something, what they were trying to say, or I would say, just a second, I'll be right back, and then I would just walk to them. And they all knew that from me being a student, so they were very aware of how they communicated with me, and because of that, I felt like I was part of the team, and I felt like I was respected and valued as a therapist. The third thing is the phone. That's nothing new. I do not like using landline phones. They're very staticky. They are not compatible with your hearing aid or your cochlear implant because there's interference of the actual technology that's in your ear on top of the phone. So it's really hard to have a clear, concise communication on landline phone for me. There are different types of captioning phones out there. There's many different brands, but I had asked my director for this job. As a student, I didn't use the phone, so I wasn't sure if that was going to change as a therapist, and she assured me that that wouldn't be a problem, and I really wouldn't use the phone unless we, later on realized I might need it more than we thought. And if we do, then we'll just order it, no problem. And the fourth thing was, because we did some home health visits, I was required to take the 3 things that are important: your heart rate, your oxygen level, and your blood pressure. So I couldn't hear through a stethoscope, and the sound of your blood pressure and your heart rate are in the low frequencies. And I don't hear low frequency sounds. So what they did for me, they ended up getting me a digital device for each thing, and so instead of me having to worry about listening, all I had to do was push the button, got my answer, put down the heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen level, and then moved on. So since 2012, I have had 4 jobs. So my third job, I experienced a lot of discrimination. the company wanting me to do things that were not ethical, and on top of it, not being very accommodating. So you guys know the accommodations that I've mentioned earlier about what I usually ask, and that hadn't changed at this point at this job. But one of the things that this facility was really big on was using the phone. And so I asked to make sure to have a phone with captioning on it. And several months went by and none of the accommodations I asked for ever went through. And at that point, I was just really uncomfortable as a therapist and as a person with a disability. I was not respected, I was not heard, I was not appreciative, I was none of those things. And that was a big lesson for me to learn, that as a therapist, I deserve better, and as a person with a disability, with the ADA laws in Kentucky, I for sure am supposed to have access to effective communication, and none of those things were happening. Yes, there are ADA laws. You can go on Kentucky website and read all about them for all kinds of disabilities, but for deaf and hard of hearing people, especially us, our biggest thing is what? Effective communication. And it's not as easy as it seems, and you have to do a lot of loopholes and a lot of talking and getting to the right person to make sure they understand what you need. And that was just not happening here. So I decided that this was a good lesson for me as a person who has ethics and who cares about how I am treated as a therapist. I left, and so I put my 2-week notice in, and I never looked back. So now since 2016, I work in Lexington, and I am self-employed, but I'm contracted out with this company. They are an outpatient clinic, and I see through them PED, and I also see acquired brain injury. This has been my favorite job. Actually, my first job and this job has been my favorite because they have just been so accommodating. So the person that I went to interview with for this job, my boss, yes, you still have a boss even if you're self-employed and you're contracted out. She was incredible because she understood where I was coming from, because she is a speech language pathologist, and her first job was working with deaf and hard of hearing kiddos. So she knew all about why I was asking for the things that I was asking. The only thing that added to my list at that time was if we were going to have a big staff meeting, because at this place, this was the biggest co-worker-wise therapist I've ever been around. There are 30 or 40 of us, give or take, plus there are front office people. So there's a lot. And I told her she wasn't sure how they were going to do staff meetings because it kind of changes. I asked to have interpreters at a staff meeting, but most of the time, those therapists that are not in the building, they usually end up coming to the staff meeting through using their speaker on their phone. And so there's not really as many people as I thought there was. And she's really great about making sure I understand everything that's going on. So at this point, I don't feel like I've needed an interpreter. But just to clarify, if you ever hire an interpreter, you should know that most interpreters, 9 out of 10 times, they work for themselves. They're freelancers. They are self-employed. They will require you to pay for travel, and they will require you to pay up to 2 hours of work. And that's the same for us as OTs who are self-employed. You would want a job that's longer than 2 hours if you're going to do PRN, because it's not going to be worth the money. And that is one of the reasons why I decided after my 3rd job I wanted to be self-employed, because if I ever were in a pinch and I could not get what I needed, I could pick my own freelancing interpreter, because I know quite a few and I have my favorites, and I could maximize as much as I needed to use them for whatever, set up meetings, set up hard phone conversations that I may not catch, set up annual meeting to discuss goals and things that might require people to use the phone to call in if they couldn't be there in person, those kind of scenarios. And then I have a business called, it's my LLC business because I'm self-employed, so my business would pay for that. Another thing about this job that's a little different than my other jobs is there's just a lot of people, and there's a lot of clients, and there's a lot of noise, and there's just a lot of background noises going on. So I do have priority. If I feel like things are chaotic and I just cannot hear, I will ask for a room and just to have a little bit more quiet and be able to make sure I can hear and understand everything that's going on during my evaluation or even during my interventions. So as far as evaluation go, and me as a therapist, how I share with my client and their families and my acquired brain injury client or whoever I see, I am straight with them. I tell them up front. I always encourage the front office to give the parents a heads up as well. I'm like, tell them their OT is deaf. Yes, she can communicate, so don't freak out. But it's nice to give the parents a heads up because I know I would want to know that, especially since I have kids of my own. The biggest thing that I do is I'm myself, and I introduce myself and say, okay, we're going to go in this room. I would really appreciate it if you sit across from me instead of behind me so that I have full access to your face because I lip read. And I want to pause here for just a second. So since I've been at this job, my hearing has changed so much. In fact, it has changed 3 times. And so I am no longer considered what you would call a person with a hearing loss or hard of hearing. I am now considered profoundly deaf, which means I hear nothing when I take my cochlear implant out. So I don't wear hearing aids anymore. So I wear what's called a cochlear implant. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So this is the microphone. And that microphone sends the message through the telecoil and into the transmitter. And so I had surgery and had an internal processor put in behind my ear. So anytime, and it's a magnet, so they clip together and this goes over my ear. So anytime someone says something, that communication is going right through into my microphone, through the transmitter, to my brain, just like that. So as you can see, the little tube at the top. Now with my hearing aid, I don't have parts of it anymore, but it's very similar except without the coil, and I have what's called an ear mold. And so with hearing aids, the purpose of them is to amplify what hearing you have left that's in your ear. And so you wear what's called ear molds, and they would keep that feedback coming in from the hearing aid to amplify. That's how you're able to hear things going on. But with the cochlear implant, I do not do anything. I bypass my entire ear, and everything is transmitted to my brain. Alright, so back to evaluations, and as far as doing therapy sessions, the biggest thing that I tell everybody, I tell them 3 things in order for us to work really well together and to make sure that our communication is clear and effective. Number 1, I cannot hear you if you're behind me talking. So a lot of my parents will forget that, and they'll start telling me something, some big story or something their kiddo did over the weekend, which is great. I want to hear it, but I cannot turn around, look at your face the whole time, and miss a chunk of our therapy session. So I will usually remind them, like, oh, I really want to hear this, but right now we're doing this. Do you mind to just write it down? And then at the end of our session, when we go over your home exercise program, you can tell me what you're trying to tell me. And the second thing is, I have to remind this for my ABI client and my coworkers. The best way to approach me is not to tap me behind me. I will literally jump out of my skin. And everybody thinks it's funny. It's not funny to me because I've been jumping out of my skin for 30 plus years, so it gets old. But I always tell them, I'm like, it's my natural reflex to immediately jump because I don't hear you. So please walk in the front and wave or do something that's not jarring. Sometimes people just flick the light, or sometimes they'll just wave and just get my attention. And this took a couple of years for people to really get it, but now I think we're all on the same page. And the third thing is, the biggest thing is for me is when, I think I've talked about this before in the video, our therapy rooms are bigger and there are a lot of kids talking, and there's a lot of noise going on in the other rooms from the other therapists, and there's just a lot of chaos. So I really struggle to hear. So when you're talking to me across the room, yes, you got my attention, yes, I can see your lips, but they're just so far out. I'm not making that connection. I don't know what you're saying. And so everyone has gotten so much better just holding their story or waiting until break time to tell me what they have to tell me. But I will say that really, truly being an OT in this setting, or any setting really, I love working with geriatrics, I love working with peds, I love working with my acquired brain injuries. I truly love working with just people in general because they are so inspiring and they make my job so rewarding, and it definitely outweighs any of the frustration that I have from time to time with my accommodations, or just being frustrated that I didn't hear what was being said or communicated. And I will tell all of my clients that just because you have a limitation or a deficit or a disability or whatever the case may be, that doesn't mean that you cannot accomplish X, Y, and Z. And we are all different and we all bring something different to the table. And that's what makes us unique. And especially my little kiddos, I really encourage them to remember that this is just a tool. And we are here to help you. We are here to cheer you on. We are here to advocate for you. We are here to implement and facilitate and put in modifications in place, make sure the adaptations are there, whatever we need to do to make sure you are functional at whatever task that we're working on. And as an OT, I've learned so much through advocating for my clients, whether it be through parents or through insurance or for themselves, whatever the case may be, because I learned how to advocate for myself and I get it. And I think that's so important as therapists to remember that at the end of the day, our job is just so much more than just showing up and just doing the assessments to figure out how we are going to work on this skill. So much more. And I have learned so much more from my client than they have from me. I know that for a fact. And I will tell you, kids are the best because I've had 2 or 3 on my caseload for a couple of years. And they've seen me weekly. And they will one day during our session, 2 years, I'm like, I've been seeing you for a long time. And they'll stop in the middle of what we're doing and they'll look at me and they'll be like, what are those things in your ears? Or what's that thing on your head? And it just shocks me because to them, this is just how I am. This is just how I speak, and this is just how we communicate. Because when I meet a new person, especially my little one, because we all know kids are not predictable and they don't sit still. So it is harder to scan and try to figure out what they're saying. But I always tell them, like, if you have something to tell Miss Jordan, or we are getting instructions from Mrs. Jordan, you need to make sure that we have got good eye contact, because I've got to make sure our communication is good, or we can't figure out what we're doing, or we can't do the activity that we have planned. And they are fine with that. Okay, so the number one question that I always get since I was young was, how do you wake up in the morning? And let me just I'm going to show it to you. So this is called a shake awake alarm clock. And what we do is we slide this under the sheet under your bed, and when the alarm goes off, it vibrates and it wakes you up. This thing, I promise you, you can never sleep through it. It feels like an earthquake. I don't love it, and I don't use it because I don't use it anymore. I used to when I was in high school, college, and when I first started out as an OT. But now I have my own personal alarm clocks, children, so anybody that has kids knows what I'm talking about. But if there's ever a really important meeting, or if I have to get up super early, I put this back on and it goes off. And this also, you can do another option. You can plug it into a lamp and the light goes on and off. But I hate being waken up by a light, so I'd rather just wake up to an earthquake. So that's definitely a question I get a lot. And then another popular question that I've always gotten is, what is it like to be deaf? And I never know how to answer that question. And so I'm always like, well, what is it like to be hearing? That's all I can respond to. But I will say now that I'm profoundly deaf, like I literally hear nothing. It is absolutely silence. So for me, before that, when I was hard of hearing, I could feel things more, like if a vehicle was going outside, or I could feel things like doors shutting or people walking. I could feel the vibration, but I can't feel that anymore now. Alright, so let's go on to my pet peeves. I have 2 of them. And they pop up as a therapist, and they pop up as I'm doing my normal thing. So, the first one is whenever I tell somebody I'm deaf, but I lip read, I immediately follow up, I lip read, and I then follow up with, I have cochlear implants, so I can hear you, but I may have some trouble catching what you're saying. 9 out of 10 times people are like, oh, okay, I gotcha. But then you have those who are like, oh no, you're deaf. Do you need me to speak up? Part of my job as a deaf person is to educate, advocate, and teach. And so I always respond with, no, thank you, I really appreciate that, but actually it's not about the volume, it's about the clarity. And so you just talk like you normally would, and I will let you know if I cannot understand you or I miss something. My second one, this hasn't come up as much as it used to, but I do have those occasional parents or clients or just people in general that I meet that are new. I will go through the whole spiel. Oh, hi, I'm deaf. I can't hear as well, but I read lips and I use a cochlear implant. And immediately they're like, oh my gosh, I know sign language. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is going to go 2 ways. Because it usually does. Either they really do know ASL and they have a family member who's deaf and we get in a really good conversation and it goes well. Or it goes this way where they learn the ABCs and maybe mommy, daddy, dog, ball from baby sign language. And it just gets really awkward really quick and they're like, oh, let me show you. A, B, C, maybe D. And I'm just like, especially when I have my OT hat on, I just smile politely and think, oh, that's great. I'm so glad you know some of the ABCs. Alright, and I just redirect because that's such a huge distraction. For me, it is a huge distraction, even though they don't realize it. For them, it keeps us from being on target of what we're supposed to be doing. So I have one more thing to add to the video, but I do want to emphasize that pre-COVID, being deaf as a therapist was so much easier than being deaf and as a therapist post-COVID. I have really struggled since the pandemic as far as a therapist and just as a person and advocating for myself and saying, I have no idea what you're saying because of the mask. And because remember, I hear you, but I also use lip reading to make that connection for that clarity of what you're saying. And that's just how I learned to communicate. And I do want to say, not all deaf and hard of hearing people lip read. I didn't know that until a few years ago, but apparently not all of us do. So, anyways, so the pandemic has been really hard. Thankfully, there's been a big push for a clear mask and using face shield if that's as an option for those who need that communication. I would say telehealth has also been a really hard barrier for me. There's a lot of static, poor internet connection. The kids run and they're just like, see ya. You know, it's hard to see their face and then lip read because they're moving a little bit more faster than they would in a therapy setting. There's just a lot more barriers. And yes, some telehealth have the closed captioning, but they're not very accurate. But I will tell you, I have played around a lot with different captioning apps, and I'm going to share the one I use. So, this is called live captioning, and then the person just starts talking, and it shows up on the screen, and 9 out of 10 times it is very accurate. So I'm going to leave my contact information. Feel free to email me and ask me anything that you would like to know from this video, or if you have questions about any of my experiences or stories I've shared, I'm happy to answer. And I hope you guys learned something new, and I enjoy doing this, and I hope to maybe meet some of you someday. So good luck with finishing out your OT schooling, and I wish the best for each and every one of you.